So again, thank you all for coming out tonight. For those on Zoom, thank you for joining us. Tonight we have the pleasure of having Dr. Katie Reinberger join us. Katie graduated from the University of Georgia in 2022 with her PhD and is now a postdoctoral research and teaching associate at the Center for Applied Isotope Studies. She's going to be really immersing us in her own research that she has done for the past 7 years in Sicily. And we're going to be learning a lot about the science that goes into archaeology. So without further ado, take it over from here. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm excited to talk about some of my research. So my talk is Ancient Allies, Exploring Isotopic and DNA Evidence of the Lives of a Diverse Classical Greek Army. And I'll get into what isotopic data means, and we'll sort of start with some of the context. So the first thing I want to give is a content warning. This presentation does show photos of human skeletal remains. The photos are included to illustrate the identification of trauma and burial placement of the skeletons that I will be discussing. These skeletal remains are from 6th to 4th centuries BCE and are excavated from the archaeological site of Himera in Sicily, Italy. So these are not recent, these are not North American, they are European in Italy. So just wanted to give that for anyone who may be sensitive to seeing human remains. So I am primarily a bioarchaeologist by training. Bioarchaeology, if you are not familiar, is the scientific study of human remains, primarily skeletal, from archaeological sites. It's predominantly population focused. So looking at how the health of populations have changed over time, and taking the primarily skeletal from archaeological sites. It's predominantly population focused. So looking at how the health of populations have changed over time, and taking the information we get from human skeletal remains and sort of extrapolating to population-based evidence. So this is, where we're getting started, and so this is where my background comes from. So jumping into the historic context. So this slide shows you Greek and Phoenician colonies among many other civilizations from the 6th century BCE. And I want to point out the red portions are the Phoenician colonies, and the blue portions are the Greek colonies. And so this time period, the 8th through the 5th century, was a time of a lot of mobility and movement of these populations across the Mediterranean. And the Greeks and the Phoenicians both were traveling from their mainlands. Phoenicia is over here in the Levant, and going and setting up colonies, setting up trading posts. And my work is primarily on Sicily, which is right in the center of the Mediterranean. And you can see that it's about a quarter of it is Phoenician settlements, and the rest of it is Greek. So it's a really important place for cultural contact. Zooming in a little closer on archaic Sicily. So the red in this map, the red colonies, the red cities are all Greek cities, and the pink cities are Phoenician settlements. And we're going to be mostly looking at the site of Himera, which is on the north central coast of Sicily. And it is right in between that Phoenician corner and the rest of the Greek part of the island. And so because it was right there and right in the middle, it was an important place of contact, of cultural contact and trade routes, not only between the Greeks and the Phoenicians, but also the Etruscans and other groups to the north and in the Italian peninsula, and as well as within the center in central Sicily were a lot of indigenous populations. But we're mostly going to be talking about the Greeks and the Phoenicians, and specifically the Carthaginians. So here's a zoom in of Himera, the ancient Greek town. So it was made up of an upper city and a lower city. The lower city was predominantly where the merchants and trade was going on. So we have the agora. You might be familiar with sort of the setup of typical Greek towns. They always have an agora for trade. And then the upper town is theorized to be where the agrarian part of society would live, because there are actually great views of the agrarian fields down to the south. So Sicily is colloquially known as a breadbasket, and in ancient times it was known as the breadbasket because it has really great climate for growing lots and lots of wheat. And so we're going to be focusing on skeletal remains down in this western necropolis. So this necropolis was occupied, or it was used from the 7th century when Himera was founded to the 5th century when Himera was destroyed. And it's right on the edge of the ancient city walls, which is important in the context of some battles that I'm going to talk about, because the battles actually took place right on the western necropolis, right on top of the cemetery. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the western necropolis. So this is just an image, and it's kind of hard to see, but as a bioarchaeologist, what I'm seeing are many different burial styles. So we see these sort of red portions are what we call cappuccina graves. So this would have been recycled roof tiles, would have been used as sort of a makeshift sarcophagus. But we also have burials that didn't have those roof tiles, that were just buried without a coffin, just in the ground. We have a mixture of more traditional supine burials, so just how we generally think of our modern Western burials, on your back with your arms either by your side or crossed over. We also have what we call flex burials, where they would actually be buried in more of a bent position. And these different burial styles are very characteristic of Himera as a city, being a place of a lot of culture contact, that we have evidence that there were indigenous populations living here, and intermarrying, have evidence of potential Phoenician goods and maybe Phoenician people and Greek people. So it's a very mixed population, mixed classes, and you can really see that in all of the different practices of burial. Thinking about our Western traditional cemeteries, that it's all pretty similar. And, comparing this to the ancient world, this is actually a very, diverse burial context. Not to mention, it's hard to see, obviously, in this image, but there's also a lot of cremations. So it wasn't just regular burial, it also included a lot of cremations. So within this Western cemetery, this Western necropolis, they found the mass graves of soldiers. And I'll get into why we know they were soldiers. But so they found one mass grave over here, pictured above here, and then several smaller mass graves further away in the Western necropolis. And I'll zoom in on where those were located. So this is just the numbers of the different mass graves there. And I'll get into the context, but there are two battles of Himera that are historically written about. Herodotus wrote about them. Diodorus Siculus wrote about them. So we have a pretty good record of what happened at these battles. And so when they found these mass graves, immediately they were connected and interested. Are these the soldiers from those battles? What can we learn about Greek warfare, and specifically the soldiers who died in these battles? And so you'll see throughout the presentation, mass graves 1 through 7, which are in the yellow, are the burials associated with the battle from 480 BCE, and mass grave 8 through 9, which is technically one grave, but at some point got waterlogged, so they had to number it separately, but it is one grave. That is from the later battle in 409 BCE. And so how do we know they are soldiers? One of the main things is that they were all male skeletons, and they were all young to mid-aged adults. So that's one indicator. The other thing is that they actually found weapons embedded in the bones of several of the skeletons. In other skeletons, we have evidence of trauma, so potential sword injuries, potential spear injuries. This is one individual who, when they excavated, still had the spear in their rib cage, very likely from a similar injury depicted in this 17th century drawing. So pretty clear that they are soldiers, and given the context, very likely from the Battles of Himera, which are, again, historically documented. And so this sort of piqued my interest. And so some of the questions that I was thinking about while doing this research is who was participating in military action in the Greek world beyond the mainland? And then what was military life like for soldiers fighting in the Western Mediterranean? I talk about the mainland because up until this point, a lot of research on Greek warfare is very heavily based on Sparta and Athenian warfare. And so we know less about the military conquests of the tyrants and the people in charge on Sicily, even though we know there's a lot of warfare happening there. So just to give you a little bit of background of what we know about Greek warfare is these hoplites with their traditional hoplite shield and armor that are very well known. This is the classic phalanx formation. They are often thought of as part of small militias of neighbors and relatives at this time. So during the 6th and 5th centuries BC, they're not professional paid soldiers. That happens much later. They're considered citizen soldiers, and being a hoplite soldier, you're expected to perform military service as part of your citizenship. There's other research that shows that these citizens must have been, these citizens must have been self-funded, must have been fairly wealthy, because hoplite armor would have actually been very expensive. And but they were still continuing, the citizens were serving their own polis or cities and those polis allies. So again, self-funded citizens, maybe fighting with neighbors and relatives, not professional, at least our understanding of at this time period. We don't have a lot of evidence until now of like mercenary soldiers existing in the Greek world or as Greek soldiers. Later, there would be centralized payment of soldiers that becomes much more popular in the 4th century. And so I bring up all this discussion of citizenship because hoplites are kind of seen as an archetype of Greek ideals of honor, citizenship, and democracy. There's a lot of connection between the development of democracy and the development of hoplite warfare, because as men are expected to fight to get citizenship rights, suddenly they want to use those citizenship rights and would like to have a say in how the government is being run if they're going to be dying for the government. But again, this is often a focus on Sparta and Athens in mainland Greece. So a lot of the writings that we have to confirm this or back this up is based on Sparta and Athens. So I'm just interested in how this Greek colony of Himera can sort of shed some light on military practices in a Greek colonial world. In terms of the timeline, I want to orient you to other battles that are happening at this time period. So 480 BC is the first Battle of Himera, and that was a Greek victory against Carthage, Carthage being a Phoenician colony quite close to Sicily. In the same year, and in the same year was also the Battle of Thermopylae. You may be more familiar with the 300 Spartans associated with the Battle of Thermopylae. That was a Greek defeat against the Persians, but it's also often considered like a very honorable defeat that actually helped the Greeks win in the Battle of Salamis against the Second Persian expedition. And so the historians are always very clear to connect the Battle of Himera to the Battle of Salamis and the Battle of Thermopylae as, isn't it interesting how the Greeks are fighting against the outsiders and those who aren't Greek, and it's all happening at the same time, and it's this big, I don't want to say conspiracy, but it's it seems like they really wanted to connect the Battle of Himera as being just as important as the Battle of Salamis, as the Battle of Thermopylae. So a little more detail about the battles of Himera. So there are two battles between the Carthaginians and the Greeks. In 480 BCE, we have a Greek victory. There was an alliance of Greek forces from Syracuse and Agrigento. Syracuse and Agrigento are two of those Greek colonies that are also on Sicily, so they're nearby. And just to talk about sort of those connections, so this is the Temple of Victory at Himera. This was built after that first battle, after that victorious battle. This is what it would have looked like in ancient times before it was destroyed in 409 BC, which was not a victorious battle. And just to, drive home the connection between Himera and Syracuse and Agrigento, whose tyrants were actually quite close, and they would frequently come to each other's aid. And especially in the Battle of 480, the tyrant of Syracuse actually came and sort of saved the day in this heroic cavalry event at the Battle of 480. So Syracuse has a very similar looking temple. This is what that temple looks like today. You might notice it's not really a temple, it's a church. But if you go inside this church, you can actually see the original Greek columns from that time period. So I just think that's an interesting connection between the two cities, the Syracuse and Himera. So moving on to the unfortunate destruction of Himera. So in 409 BCE, the grandson of the Carthaginian general from 480 actually comes back and exacts revenge on the Himerans and destroys the whole city. In this situation, there was no alliance of forces. There were some Syracusan soldiers who came at first, but then they heard that Carthage was going to attack their own city, so they had to leave. And so then they evacuated as much of the city as possible, but predominantly there just weren't as many allies. It was almost certainly just Himerans leaving to protect their own city. So I mentioned that we found all these graves, and how do we know that some are 480 and how do we know some are 409? So I just want to point out two comparisons. So this is a mass grave. Fosse Comuni is mass grave in Italian, and you'll see FC sometimes in this PowerPoint to designate those mass graves. So this is an example of one of the graves from 480 BCE. You'll notice that there are many individuals, but they're all laid out fairly respectfully. They're all next to each other. All of their heads are towards the east, and there's not a whole lot of overlap. Definitely a grave that people took their time to, be respectful. They had their time to bury the dead in a victorious battle. Comparing this to the mass grave from 409, where there are multiple layers of people piled on top of each other, more in line with what you see in mass graves of the losing side. So that's one of the evidence, one piece of evidence that we have that this is almost certainly from the later battle. Okay, so I've given you a lot of context for what sort of my big questions are and what we have coming in. I'm going to talk a little bit about the methods that we use. So I'm going to talk mostly about isotopes. Isotopes are basically, if you think back to chemistry a long time ago, isotopes are atoms of the same element with different numbers of neutrons. Neutrons are those particles that are in the nucleus of the atom, and they don't have a charge. They're just existing as a neutral component, but they do have mass. And so because there are different numbers of neutrons, the mass number of each isotope is going to be different. And because of these changes in mass, or weight, the atoms act a little differently. So the isotopes react a little bit differently depending on the system. So for example, for oxygen is a good example. There's oxygen 18 and oxygen 16. Oxygen 16, because it has a lower mass of 16, is much lighter. And so it is more readily evaporated. So oxygen 16 likes to be evaporated much easier, whereas oxygen 18, because it's mass 18, it is heavier. That doesn't really want to be evaporated. It's so heavy, it's so weighed down. What oxygen 18 loves to do is precipitate out. And those are the first atoms that are going to fall in a rainstorm. So that's just a very brief. You don't really need to understand all of the components of that for the rest of this presentation. I try to break it down fairly simply. Just take my word for it that they act a little differently. And so the isotopes in the world, the isotopes in your diet specifically, go into your gut and then get incorporated through your blood into your tissues, so muscle and bone. I'm going to be talking mostly about bone and teeth. Bone is special because it remodels over time, so it changes and is constantly incorporating things. So your bones are a more recent representation of the isotopes that you were consuming in life. The other tissue is teeth, so enamel, your tooth enamel. That forms when you are a child and it doesn't change. It stops incorporating any elements, any isotopes. So the isotopic signature, that of the area that you were born and raised and had your childhood, that's going to be what your isotopic signature is in your teeth for the rest of your life. So that's just really basic, all you need to know for this presentation. I'll talk a little bit. So this is how all elements work and how all isotopic analysis works, but I'm going to give you a more specific example of strontium. So strontium is actually from the soil and the bedrock on which we live, the geology on which we live. That gets taken up into the plants, that enters the food chain, and strontium likes to substitute for the calcium in our teeth and bones. So that's just another example of one of those pathways. So when I'm doing isotope analysis, I am looking at proxies of identity. And so identity can be made up of a lot of different components. What isotope analysis is best at telling us about is place of origin, which I'm going to talk about oxygen and strontium, and then diet. And that's going to be based on carbon and nitrogen. To get a little more detailed, so oxygen is going to be based on the water that you consume. Strontium is going to be based on the local geology on which you live and had your childhood, etc. Nitrogen is going to be based on your trophic position. For humans, we're more or less looking at animal or animal product consumption. So for example, vegans have a very different nitrogen value, a much lower nitrogen value than someone who eats a lot of meat or someone who eats a lot of dairy. And then carbon, the last isotope system, we're mostly looking at plants. So C3 versus C4. In the US, we are often looking at people who eat a lot of wheat or people who eat a lot of corn. Corn and other similar grasses tend to be C4 plants. In the Mediterranean, C3 plants are wheat, and C4 plants tend to be things like millet and sorghum. And those are the main Mediterranean things we're consuming. The other thing that carbon tells us about is terrestrial versus marine. So the marine signature has a very high carbon value. Okay, so just a little more sort of layering on the isotope information that you need. So oxygen, I mentioned, is related to your water consumption. And water is actually very easy to predict what the oxygen value is going to be based on things like altitude, things like latitude, things like precipitation and temperature. So you can see this this simplified map of like the expected oxygen values for certain parts of the world. So you can see the Sahara is going to have very high oxygen isotope ratios compared to northern climes. And once you get sort of zoomed in smaller, like here, you can see places like Mount Etna, which is a volcano in Sicily and has a pretty high altitude, is going to have much lower oxygen values compared to places along the coast. So again, this just gives us a predictable range of oxygen values for Sicily and for Himera. A lot of what we do in isotope analysis is sort of predict what are the expected ranges, and then is anyone falling outside of those ranges. Moving on to strontium. So strontium is going to be based on geology. And generally with geology, we're looking at the age of the rock. The older the bedrock, the higher the strontium values will be. The younger the bedrock, the lower the strontium values will be. So I can use a map like this, which has the ages of the underlying bedrock, and create a predicted strontium isotope map. So again, Mount Etna is a volcano, so it has a lot of pretty young deposits because it's like spewing out things constantly. So that's where we're going to see the lowest strontium values, whereas up near modern day Messina are some deposits of Precambrian bedrock. So those would actually have some higher strontium values. So again, it just provides us a potential range of what we expect for these regions. Okay, so looking at some data. So here on the x-axis, I have oxygen, again, sort of predicted water ranges. And on the y-axis, I have strontium values. In the gray box in the middle of the graph, based on local baseline sampling, so I collected a lot of modern water, modern peat for Himera. This is the expected range of Himera. And so the soldiers are organized into blue triangles for the first battle from 480 BCE. The later battle are the red squares, and the civilians are going to be those black circles. So what we can see is that civilians, and actually most of the soldiers from 409 BCE, are pretty similar to the expected Himera range, kind of indicating that they likely were from Himera, or at least a place that looks isotopically similar to Himera. What we can also see is that soldiers from 480 BC are all over the place. They are taking up this whole graph. Definitely don't seem to be from Himera. And these are some smaller ranges, but this is the expected area for Agrigento and Syracuse, those other two colony sites. And so a lot of these soldiers don't even seem to be from those sites or from Sicily at all. And so that's what we kind of concluded, is that the percentage of non-local soldiers from the first battle is actually quite high compared to soldiers from the later battle and compared to the civilians. I sort of talked about Himera being a place for a lot of culture contact, so it doesn't surprise me that some of the people from Himera would be non-local, meaning that they were likely children elsewhere and then they moved to Himera later. But the fact that, the first battle has actually quite a high percentage of non-locals was a very interesting finding. So thinking about diet, sort of changing gears here for a minute, so that carbon and nitrogen I was talking about. So on this graph, you're about to see one for the individuals from Himera, but again, I mentioned C3 to C4 plants, you're going to see an increase in the carbon values along the x-axis. And then going up on the nitrogen y-axis is going to be increasing trophic levels. So in this simplified example, we have a C3 plant, such as trees and wheat, getting consumed by the deer means that's going to increase the trophic position. That deer gets eaten by a wolf, that's going to increase the trophic position. So we can sort of predict where individuals might be. The marine component actually increases a lot nitrogen-wise and carbon-wise because there are so many changes. There's some massive food chains that happen in marine systems where you have tiny fish eating kelp, and then medium fish eating tiny fish. And every single time you get bigger and bigger and bigger, that increases the trophic position. So you end up getting things like walruses with these hugely high nitrogen values. So that's just sort of keep that in mind when you look at this chart. So from here, we can see based on these values, I would say a majority of a C3 diet. So most of these individuals are eating C3 plants, such as wheat. There is a little bit of, or there's a fair amount of variation for those soldiers from 480 BCE, indicating that they likely had a different diet, possibly C4 plants. We're not really seeing a marine signature here because they're not really increasing trophic level as well. The other thing that I want to point out that maybe might not be surprising looking at their oxygen and strontium data is that the soldiers from 409 BCE and the civilians are all pretty similar. They're all clustering right there, whereas the soldiers from 480 are not. They have a much more varied diet. I talk about it a little bit in the conclusion, but my general takeaway from this is that I don't necessarily think that soldiers were being, they didn't have like a special diet for soldiers. I think what we're seeing here is geographic variation in isotopic signatures, but that the diet is actually quite similar. But I can answer any questions you have about that after the talk. So sort of thinking about this data. So some issues that I've identified, and the big question here are mercenaries for me. So the presence of non-locals in 480 BCE strongly suggests the use of mercenaries. We know that Greek mercenaries, so people who were Greek, were used in foreign armies. They were actually pretty well known for their military prowess. But there's limited evidence of Greek armies using mercenaries, or at least Greek armies using mercenaries who were not Greek themselves. And that's this has been kind of a contentious topic because, as I mentioned, Greek hoplites are sort of known for like honor and citizenship. And so who are these foreign mercenaries who are coming into Greek armies and then maybe becoming a citizen? So there's been kind of a question on that. But I do want to talk about the use of mercenaries in general, because at the site of Himera, at the battle site, we actually do find greaves or military shin guards, is the way I like to describe them. They were found at Himera, and interestingly, they were found on what we think was the ancient surface of the ground and not buried with anyone. So it seems more like what was a pretty common practice after a battle was to strip soldiers of any armor that they had and either reuse it for yourself or just dump it and leave the person without any armor. And so that's what they actually think happened here. So these greaves that they found were actually sourced to be likely from Iberia, so modern day Spain. So the current theory by the archaeologists is that these greaves were from the Carthaginian side, because we know from Herodotus that there were supposedly 300,000 Phoenicians, Libyans, Iberians, etc., fighting in the Battle of Himera, but on the Carthaginian side. So because we don't think that the mass graves are actual Carthaginian soldiers, we're pretty confident that they are Greek soldiers. So we're pretty sure that this is from the Phoenician side, and gives some more evidence that there were definitely mercenaries on the Carthaginian side. But question, are there any on the Greek side. So these are some questions I had about the origin. So the isotopic baselines that I showed you are uncharacteristic of expected signatures for Syracuse and Agrigento, which indicates that the soldiers likely, the non-local soldiers, weren't just non-local to Himera, but probably non-local to even Sicily at all. So the next question you might be wondering is, well, maybe some mainland Greeks came and were helping the fight. However, as I pointed out, the mainland Greeks were entrenched in the Persian Wars at the time. There are some historic texts that are asking, that is like one side are the mainland Greeks asking the tyrants on Sicily, hey, can you lend us some soldiers? And the Greeks in Sicily saying, hey, can you lend us some soldiers? And everyone's like, no, we're a little busy with our own stuff. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of movement, or at least purposeful movement or organized movement of mainland Greeks coming over to Sicily. So some questions about Greeks from Iberia. There were some Greek colonies in Iberia. Maybe they came, or maybe they're not Greek at all, was our big question. And so I was on a team that actually did some DNA analysis of many of these soldiers. And we found that there's actually some very diverse genetic origins of several of these soldiers. We weren't able to do DNA analysis on all of them because it is very expensive and these skeletons are poorly preserved, and you need fairly well preserved skeletons to do DNA analysis. And so I'll get into some of the details of this very complicated graph. So I want to point out, so the red squares in these graphs are the 480 soldiers. That's from the first battle that we have isotopic evidence suggesting that they're from a lot of different places. The blue squares are from the later battle in 409. Orange squares are the Himeran civilians. And a green square is also a Himeran civilian. And then these blue circles are from an indigenous site on Sicily. So this is comparing to many archaeological already published DNA data. And so I'm just going to sort of point out a couple of clusters that I think are interesting. So the one is sort of this pinkish red color. This is late Bronze Age Sicily. So these are skeletons from Bronze Age sites on Sicily. And so they sort of cluster here. There's a small cluster of the expected mainland Greece haplogroups. So people who seem to be more similarly related to Greeks tend to be over here. Over here in the sort of reddish and pointing to it are the Italian peninsula. So we do see a lot of the civilians and a lot of the soldiers from 409 BCE are kind of characteristic of what we would expect, that this was a Greek colony, therefore they likely shared a lot of DNA with Greeks. There is some indicator that maybe there was some mixing with indigenous populations, which would have been more similar to this Sicily signature. And then we also have some individuals that are like kind of close to the Italian peninsula. So all very expected. But you may wonder, what about those other groups? So I've sort of highlighted a couple of them. So we have two individuals who seem to be from the Eurasian steppe. So most similar to like the central steppe. So this is up towards Russia and Mongolia, which I think is very interesting because there isn't a lot of evidence of that type of movement at this time period. We know that the Mediterranean and is a place for a lot of movement, but that's very far away for this time period. We also have some individuals from the Caucasus Mountains, which is interesting. These individuals that are kind of close to Italy, to that Italy cluster, are also very close to Iberia. So this is some archaeological DNA from sites in Iberia. And again, these are all archaeological evidence, or archaeological DNA. So that's kind of an interesting connection. We know that Iberia was trading with Sicily at this time, but this is kind of the first real evidence of maybe there were actual people involved, and it wasn't just a trading relationship. And so here's just a sort of summary of all of those. We also have 2 individuals who seem to be from the Baltic, which is interesting. And so, yeah, it just seems like a very diverse group. If we were thinking they were just Greeks, it seems like they would mostly be mapping onto here, even if they were Greek colonies. So even Greeks just founding colonies elsewhere. But there does seem to be a lot of introduction of, some other genetic groups in there, which I find interesting. So a few conclusions. So the soldiers from the earlier battle definitely represent a group of people who are quite mobile, traveling from all over the Mediterranean and even beyond. Just really simply, the diet for both soldiers and civilians seemed to be consistent. Variations seemed likely more from geographic differences. In general, this means they were having majority wheat with some C4 contributions, especially the C4 contributions seem mostly for non-local soldiers. The big question in the field, which I'm happy to answer questions about, is that we don't see any marine signature, even though this is a coastal town, and we know the Greeks like to fish, so why isn't it showing up in their isotopic data? That's just a huge question. Continuing with conclusions, so ancient DNA evidence indicates presence of foreign mercenaries in a Greek army at the First Battle of Himera. Warfare was clearly a factor in continental scale human mobility and culture contact. And this, I want to point out that, we know that warfare is big at bringing people together for violent purposes. And we know that people have used military expansion in ways, but it really wasn't heard of to do it before Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great did a lot of this, but it wasn't until the 4th century BCE boom in military expansion. So this is kind of some early examples of a lot of movement, a lot of use of mercenaries. And so some other conclusions or things that I'm thinking about are the role of mercenaries in local communities. Obviously, mercenaries being brought in for military action creates opportunities for cultural exchange, but it also provided a pathway to citizenship. We do have some historical records that indicate that mercenaries were suddenly becoming citizens of these communities that they were a part of. And during this time period, there's a lot of being a citizen meant you had to be Greek, you had to be a Greek man. And so if foreign mercenaries are allowed to become citizens, what does that mean for our understanding of Greek citizenship and Greek cities and democracy at this time period? And so I just want to close with this quote from Thucydides, and something that I sort of like to talk about in my talks is that it is a privilege to be able to work with human skeletal remains. And working with Stefano Vassallo, our Italian collaborator and colleague on the excavation, he really sort of drove home how important and everything this work is. And so I just really love this quote about, and it reminds you that human skeletal remains are often a way to connect us to people who can't really tell our stories. It's not like soldiers themselves were the ones writing down the history. Histories were written more about the tyrants and the people in charge. And so bioarchaeology can be a way to give voice and give stories to people who don't really have that opportunity otherwise. So with that, thank you for listening. I want to acknowledge some people who helped this research possible, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Can I ask a question, please?
Okay.
Some of the hold on a second, Robin.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Of the where the soldiers came from on one of the maps, earlier maps you had, that the Eurasian steppe people, where would they have come from?
That's
The Eurasian steppe.
the Eurasian steppe.
But
Yes.
do we have any idea how they would have ended up in that?
So that's something we're still sort of trying to figure out there. I'm not as familiar with the geography of the Eurasian steppe. I feel like this is something Dr. Reevy would help with. So maybe in our car ride home we'll talk about it. But there is a group of people during this time period, the Scythians, who are sort of from this area, who are well known for being mercenaries in this time period, especially later. And so I'm sort of wondering if this could be some evidence of Scythian action. Again, people that we know were well known for being mercenaries and were brought in to be mercenaries. And now we have some potential genetic evidence.
I see as a possibility that in a battle, people from different locales specialize. I've read in different kinds of war, of fighting. Slingers.
Yes.
Archers.
Yes.
More from one area to another. And I think it's interesting that the geographic location are different places on the battlefield, which I sort of see this as an outline of where they died and where the different groups of the soldiers with the different kinds of weapons were located. Like the archers could have been in one area, not that I know where archers were, but or the slingers that were hired to bring brought in, but they were further off because they had longer range weapons.
Yeah, and I haven't looked at the DNA data compared to, this is a pretty recent article. I haven't looked at the DNA data compared to where they were buried in the mass graves. That would be interesting to see. On the top of my head, I don't think these sort of outlying groups were actually buried together. But
well, it probably would have been brought together there.
Yes, absolutely. But I think there was some question of would people from the same area be buried together because they were.
Okay.
But no, that's a great thing to think about. Mm-hmm.
There's a question online from Robin Hall.
Okay.
Robin, go ahead. See if you can hear him.
Thank you. Herodotus reported that there were, 300,000 warriors that Hamilcar brought in for the first battle. Though, of course, that was probably a grave exaggeration. But I'm wondering how you can be sure that the corpses that you're finding are specifically Greek, as opposed to possibly being part of the Carthaginian forces, which would go some way to explaining why there were Iberian and other remote European DNA groups involved.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question was, how can we be sure these are Greek soldiers and not, or soldiers from the Greek side versus soldiers from the Carthaginian side? The short answer is that bodies of the losing side would not have been treated particularly well and would have, like, you wouldn't have spent manpower respectfully burying the dead of a losing side, that more likely you would see a massive cremation of the soldiers. So that's one indicator. There are some, I didn't really get into it, but there are some grave goods on these, like within these mass graves, that strongly suggest that they are Greek. So they're more Greek grave goods that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see with a Carthaginian army. and that it was unlikely that you would have mixed Carthaginian soldiers with Greek soldiers in these mass graves. So that's the current archaeological theory. Yes.
Well, extending that issue then, graves 8 and 9 were very much more a mass burial of no great respect.
Yes.
The contemporary reports of what happened post the second battle was that Hannibal Mago was responsible for something like 3,000 civilian deaths, basically wiping out the bulk of the population. Could that possibly be a grave which is not warriors of either side, but in fact the poor civilians who were slaughtered in revenge for the defeat in the first battle?
Yes. So
Can you summarize the question?
yes. Yes. So that question is, so the historical records of the later battle are that the Carthaginians defeated the Greeks and proceeded to slaughter everyone who was still there. So within those historical records, there's evidence that at least all the women and children were able to be evacuated. There are some burials. So because all of these individuals tend to be men, middle to young to middle age, that they are likely to be at least the Himeran soldiers. And so, who are considered the soldiers if it's all the civilians left behind. But there are, in addition to these mass graves, right outside of the wall, there are several things, several burial types that we called, they're basically like mini mass graves. And so the archaeologists are theorizing that these smaller mass graves that are all kind of taking place right outside the wall that aren't part of these mass graves would actually have been the civilians who were remaining. And so potentially evidence of those slaughtered. But that is a good question, and something that, we're keeping in mind as we theorize, as we interpret our data. So something to think about.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes.
I wanted to ask about the mercenaries. Just how organized were they, or were they organized, or were these individuals in so many different locations? I mean, were there individuals who actually do this, or are these people present and they decided that they were warriors and they wanted to earn citizenship, or just earn money, or were there groups?
Both. I believe there were both. Yes. A short answer. Yeah. I just had a thought and then it floated away. Yes, we know that there were groups of people. I think the most famous is Xenophon's Anabasis, of this huge group of people who just decided to be mercenaries and fought down and fought several different battles together. But there were definitely also individuals who sought mercenary status. There's a lot of different reasons why people would engage in mercenary action. Some of it just being they wanted honor, they wanted glory, they wanted some money. Some were trying to escape bad poverty. Some, because mainland Greece at this time is starting to be overcrowded, and so it might have been a better economic idea to leave crowded Greece and become a mercenary elsewhere. So there's a variety, and yes, there were we're not sure about here specifically, but we know historically that there were definitely groups of people who were mercenaries together. Yeah.
The Phoenicians, if I remember my history, were very early traders all over the known world at that time. Mm-hmm. Known being a kind of fuzzy idea, but all the way up into England looking for tin, for example. So it's not surprising to me that there's a lot of people from a lot of different parts of the world getting together. Why they gathered on Sicily, I don't know. But it looks like that long distance trading operation would find people who were interested in seeing the world or whatever, hooking on with the Phoenicians and maybe settling somewhere else with an opportunity to be a citizen at Himera, for example, might be attractive.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's been one of those, like, yes, it's not surprising that people were moving all over. We know people were moving. It is interesting that, of the civilians that we measured, none of the civilians of Himera are necessarily as far reaching. So it does seem, at least from this limited data set that we have, it does seem like we're seeing the majority of the genetic diversity in the soldiers themselves, which also isn't necessarily surprising because soldiers do tend to be more mobile. But it's not like the soldiers are coming only from a one population that happens to be genetically diverse. It seems like it's from different areas.
A slightly different connection. You mentioned the indigenous people a couple of times, and Kennedy's predecessor worked for several years in the far western end of Sicily, and he used to talk about doing archaeological excavations with 14 cultural levels to plow through. And we get excited about 3 around here, but he was able to rattle off all these levels, and I'm trying to figure out what the heck is indigenous if this change is so frequent, because everybody and his brother and his dog seem to have fought on Sicily.
Yeah.
Over what, 2,000 years or more than that, I guess.
More than that, yeah.
So who are you defining as the indigenous people?
So indigenous sites on Sicily. There are anywhere from 2 to 3 known indigenous groups. I say 2 to 3 because when I was first learning, there were definitely 3, and then a couple of years later, it was like, no, it's probably just 2, and 2 of one of them had 2 different names depending on who you talked to and who was writing it down. So the 3 groups are the Sicani, the Siculi, and the Alibini. And they had sort of different regions in Sicily that they occupied. And there's some evidence, so this is sort of their genetic haplogroup, the evidence of indigenous Sicilians there, which I believe in this article, we talk more that there is some connection to some Middle Eastern populations. So they're still kind of trying to figure out where these indigenous groups came from. But yes, there were several of them.
I was wondering about orientation of the civilian graves. In your early slide, I didn't catch it all, but it looked like they were generally oriented the same direction as far as their head and feet. I was wondering what direction that is, and if you know why they were oriented that way.
I don't know specifically why, like ritualistically or religiously, why they were facing that way. I can tell you that, again, these graves tend to be more facing the east. I don't know if my image of the necropolis has a north arrow.
I didn't see one.
I think it's a, but so that grave that I pictured just a second ago, so that is this one right here. So this is east, this is north here. And so from what I remember, there is actually a mixture. They do tend to face, like the majority of them faced east, like heads to the east, east to the west, feet to the west. But it's not all of them. there is a little bit of variation there.
But that's the soldiers though, right there. Okay, this is what you were asking about in it.
Yeah. And so no, I don't have a north arrow on here, so I'm not 100% sure what direction they're facing. They do tend to be right there. There's a north arrow. Yes. Okay. So yeah, they're also mostly facing east to west. But no, I don't know the significance of.
What about the height of the soldiers? Is it, you know, anything about how tall they were? Were they generally about the same height as far as the ones from different areas, or did they vary a lot?
I don't have like the height, like the physical, how tall the soldiers were. I don't have specific numbers off the top of my head from the burials, from the skeletons that I worked on and measured. I believe we were getting a lot of 5'3" to 5'7", but I'm also remembering this one individual who was gigantic, was like 6'4" or something, had these massive bones, but they seemed fairly average for, you know, modern day heights. It didn't seem like the population was significantly shorter than we are today. Any other questions?
You mentioned something about the seafood right there at the end, and I didn't catch what your thought about was. It these people are living on an island and they're not eating fish?
That is what the isotope analysis tells us.
Oh.
There's that graph. So if I was to take this graph here and put it onto this graph here, they would be about here. So this is where pretty much all the soldiers and civilians are. So there really isn't any evidence.
Civilians are not eating fish either?
Apparently not. According to the isotopic values, the best, so there's sort of two different explanations that allows for them to be eating fish. One is that they eat fish, but it's not as often as we would think. So unfortunately, with isotopic analysis, we can't really measure amounts. We just know that like there wasn't a significant component. So maybe they were eating fish once a month or twice a month. And so that wouldn't be enough to necessarily change their isotopic values, because this is a aggregate of everything that they're eating. The other thought is that there's a lot of fish in the Mediterranean, especially that you even eat today, things like sardines and anchovies, which are actually very low on the trophic position because they're so small. And so that's one theory, is that they are eating fish. They're not eating a lot of the large fish. They're eating mostly the small fish. And this is what Sicilians eat all the time now. So yeah, that's.
Well, is it possible that you mentioned that they were the breadbasket of that area? Maybe these are primarily the farmers and the people who are dependent on the farmers. And right along the coast, there's a bunch of fishermen who are feeding themselves and maybe not feeding the farmers because the farmers are doing the farming.
It's possible.
So maybe, how close to the ocean is this battleground?
Very close.
Well, it looked like it was in the map, but yeah.
So this is the battlefield. This is the town. The river would have gone here, and it's actually
that's the ocean at the north, right?
And that's the ocean. Yeah. Like you can see from the where were we? We would be working here, and we could see the ocean. I mean, it's
okay. You would think there would be. No, okay.
Yeah.
So much for that.
No. Yeah.
Another thought is that mercenaries may not, particularly from these other areas, may not have been in that area that long.
That might not have been
They may
fishing
have,
or something.
they may have been brought in for the battle
Yeah,
and they've only been there months,
yeah.
but not years to get.
Oh, good point.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh,
I didn't think it was that loud. That's a good conclusion. Yes, so that's a great thought. Yeah, they were brought in. There's been some question of, well, how are they getting there? They're obviously taking a boat. So why wouldn't they have been eating fish on the boat? But yeah, so this is just a big, and this isn't a question unique to Himera. There's actually many Greek sites and Roman sites at that are right along the coast that do not have isotopic evidence of eating fish, even though archaeologically we're finding fish hooks, we're finding net weights that they were using for fishing. We have images of like drawing of fish. We have fish recipes, but apparently it's not showing up in their bones. But that is one, one limitation of isotopic analysis. Any other questions?
Well, thank you very much.